Hi everybody. I'm Sean Wainsteim. I'm the filmmaker who made Demon Box. Thanks for watching.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and launch in then. If that's all
Hmm.
right. I've got, as usual, more questions and things to touch on than we'll necessarily get to, but I prefer that to the alternative.
Love it.
Um, so I will say, first of all, I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, and I'm also the son of a Holocaust studies scholar. And so one thing about
Wow.
the film, yeah, I know, right? One thing about the film that really resonated with me beyond just what I saw as a fresh approach to the broader subject of the Holocaust, is the way that more than most films I've ever seen, it treated the messiness of being the descendant of a survivor, kind of unwillingly charged with the responsibility of conveying something, anything to the children that we may have. And all of this is to say, I'm interested to know how you landed on the approach you took, the sort of meta, darkly humorous approach to these topics, because it's not something I had seen done really much at all.
Thank you for that. That's very kind. And I feel like I want to interview you about your father, and I'm also greatly jealous that you were in a place where they were able to look at it with an open eyes and discuss it. Um, Clearly not something I was able to do with my parents.
Mm,
Um, it was discussed, but in probably different set of contexts. Um, yeah, I spent 10 years making this movie, and it changed a lot over the course of making it.
mm,
I joke now that the film is a hot mess, and I feel like I genuinely feel like it is,
mm,
but I feel like it's better to tell a story in a mess than not to tell it at all. And I feel like it's something with I guess when we've got to the point where we are now, where there's so few people left alive to give living testimony. It's especially now as it's not as understood anymore. Like I had to put in uh, the Holocaust, people that went through the Holocaust in a very literal way, as opposed to just having the shorthand of, oh, there's a number on an arm. I'm like, wait, not everybody knows that anymore. Not everyone knows what that is, and having to check my own assumptions there. Um, yeah, I kept trying to reshape what it is, but I feel like people in our generation who are trying to tell a story tell it messily because they want to say everything all at once, especially in a short film. I know I did.
mm,
Felt like you're speaking not only for your own experience, but your parents' experience, for the people who survived, for all the people who didn't. Like that weight of it all is something that definitely motivated my life as well as that I
mm,
tried to put in the film. Um, so that I think there's no way that can't come out in a mess. And I think trying to make a film about trauma from within trauma
mm.
will generally lead to a messy thing. But again, it's better to talk about it than to not talk about it. Um, so yeah, how it came about. Um, I'd been creatively circling around these themes in my own work for since I started making anything that could be described as work in art school, but not wanting to dive into the center, not wanting to make a Jewish film, not wanting to do whatever because it felt like part of it felt like cliche, part of it felt like I didn't have a right to speak about it. There's other things to speak about. Um, and then finally, this is the point of me trying to dive into the middle of it. And of course, I did with some magic realism. Um, Instead of actually diving into it directly. So yeah, animatronic deer. That seems smart. Uh, I was working with a playwright whose work I really admire named Aurora de Pena. And she brought her own things into it because her work is always this beautiful magic realism
Mm,
plays that are gorgeous and wonderful, and you're laughing through them and feeling emotions, and it's all very lighthearted. And then three-quarters of the way through, you're like, oh my gosh, this is what this film is about, or this play is about.
mm,
And I'm like, I want
mm,
that for my movie.
mm,
And she basically did that. And then I was reading this beautiful poetic version of the story that was sort of told through her lens. I'm like, that's not my movie. That's not actually what happened to me. And so all the things I asked her to do, I'm like, that's not specific enough. That's not who I am.
mm,
So she was very kind about us going back and forth a few times. And then We applied for funding in Canada. You can get funding from various arts agencies, which I was able to get from a few. But the first change that happened was sort of between applying and getting the result was I found out that I was going to have a son. And I didn't know that ahead of time. So
Oh, wow.
it it started to feel very disingenuous to make a film about generational trauma without talking about where it was going to go down the road, and where all the things that affected me and how would they. That was very much preoccupying myself in terms of how do I tell these stories that almost killed me. What is the way to do it? When do you do it? How do you do it? I'd probably ask you at some point. Um, and so that was the first change that happened. And then also the cost of having a kid put the film on hold for a while.
Uh-huh.
I kept rewriting different crews, different things, trying to find windows. Making a short film is difficult financially. I put a fair bit into the movie, time and finances, um, and wanted to maximize that with the window that was open at a studio to build some things or to work with my
Mm,
cinematographer that I love working with, and he's able to get a certain amount of gear that helps make it look pretty good, which he does. Um, and so we eventually were able to film in 2019, just before the pandemic.
wow. Yeah.
Uh, Pandemic happened, and then my grandfather, who is filmed in the film, um, he passed away at age 100. Um,
Mm,
so then that changed the film, and that sort of felt like it wanted to be in the film as well. So the character of the grandfather is kind of an amalgam of both my Zadie's, and one who was in camps, and then one who's not but lost everybody.
mm,
And he was in the Russian army at the time, and then had to sneak his way across borders, and my mom came out in Paris, and then they got to Canada. And then the film ultimately got a few rejections that I took to heart when I probably shouldn't have.
mm,
Um, but it was enough people around me were just that I really trust and are generally really critical. Like, no, no, this is an important film. This is great. This is wonderful. I'm like, you're just working on crappy TV, and that's why this matters to you more. But I felt like, of course that festival will take it. That'd be ridiculous. That'd be stupid not to. And then so when I got some rejections, despite it being not sound mixed or VFX done, or it wasn't a final thing, I sort of went like, oh, I guess I'm a failure. And then I took that
mm,
all to heart. And then after working on it that long, and I just basically went into the closet over there in the corner with the microphone I bought and just started recording those feelings
mm,
as is. And then I didn't touch the edit. So it's like uh, pairing those two things up, it started to feel really interesting to see it as um, this sort of meta director's commentary on the film while you're watching the film, and hopefully there's still something in between those two layers, or the distraction takes you somewhere else, but it adds to the mess, and hopefully it adds an extra layer of honesty and humor and um irreverence, but also
mm.
genuine heart. uh yeah, it was happy to for how that worked out.
So the idea for the meta commentary, the narration, wasn't there from the beginning, is what you're saying.
There was always narration, but it wasn't as meta. And I went through,
Ah.
I'm going to say like 100 different versions where here's a poetic fairy tale version of storytelling, and
Mm,
here's some other stuff. But yeah, here's a British lady talking. So I had recorded a bunch and had a few friends. It's first person, third person. It became clear pretty early on that it should be first person, and then
mm,
talking to a few friends, all of a sudden like they were sort of commenting on like, oh, I didn't actually know that about you. Oh, that's an interesting thing. Like, oh, that's not a, you know, thoughts that you hear much or is common. Then okay, let's see what that looks like and how it lines up with the story.
hmm Yeah, I mean, first of all, the commentary, the narration, from the start seemed very Jewish to me in several ways. Self-deprecating humor, very analytical, kind of even what you could call kind of stuck in your head kind of sense. And I think that,
Thank you.
oh, you're very welcome. It's been so many years since I read it that maybe this is way off base. It made me think of the sort of Portnoy's complaint kind of,
Right.
it's in a way, it's a story about storytelling as much as it's a story.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is just that if I remember right, the first spoken line of narration is this movie's been rejected by from about a dozen festivals. And I think even the first time I saw the film, but certainly subsequently when I watched it again, I thought, well, that has the ring of truth. That seems like something that might be true. And then I thought, I don't know if it is or not.
Yeah.
Seeing the completed film, I can see how it wouldn't be to everyone's liking or to every festival's liking. But then I began to think about, there's the reality, and then there's the reality depicted in the film that has a relationship to what has actually happened. And I think you capture that well in the sugar anecdote.
Yeah.
And to me, that spoke a lot to how, for many filmmakers, Jewish and otherwise, their lived reality is in relationship to the reality or realities they depict on screen, but there can be a real blurring of the borders, right? And with the sugar, the upshot is he may have just seen it in a film,
Yeah.
but it feels real. There's the truth of it is not based on facts, it's based on the symbolism or the poetry or whatever. It feels true enough, right? And I felt that characterized the film in many ways as well.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's thank you for noticing all that. I mean, there's a very specific different narrative modes used to look at every different time frame. So it's, I mean, the kid's story with the demon monster and his grandfather is, I mean, it's kind of calls back to Spielbergian lighting and like here's classic cinema. Here's the way the camera moves that way. The teen is more sort of handheld. There's Super 8 archival stuff. There's a throwback to the Eastern European stuff. So it's like it didn't matter if the Nazi costume is historically accurate. It matters if like this is what we think of when we think of a movie. What is the kid's version of this? So I don't know how much of that comes through, but it's all part of the mess. Um, yeah, he said something else I was going to touch on in there, but I'm trying to remember. Uh,
Was it about the sugar or something else?
I mean, that was it was a true story. He told me that story, and I couldn't believe it at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
then it was literally deathbed. I'm like, what was the deal with that? Like,
Wow.
because at the time he was just fully earnest about it all. I was like, no, no, that happened. That's what we did. I'm like,
Hmm.
what? This doesn't make any sense. I
Well,
kept trying to find any kind of historical basis for that, and I couldn't at
mm.
all. And then yeah, so like I don't now. Then I would start searching like what fucking movie was that? Where did he? The hell did
It's
he see
it
that?
either way, it's very cinematic image, so
Yeah, yeah. I
um
think I think I was going to go down the road of like it's been hard to classify the film, and it's I think that's been part of the rejections initially anyway.
mm,
Is it a narrative? Is it a documentary? Is it a genre film? Is it an experimental film?
hmm
Um, some ways it's not narrative enough for a narrative film, and it's not
mm,
documentary enough for a documentary film
hmm
festival. It does really well at genre film festivals, strangely, which has been I've been very grateful. It's been kind of won a bunch of awards and traveled around the world in that regard. And it's I think people are not used to having feelings. I mean, to me, it's nothing scarier than all that stuff. It's all terrifying, and the zombie monster kind of, I guess, hits the checkbox of, yep, it's a genre movie.
Well, and I
Um,
think that genre festivals are also more used to films that are have a fluidity that aren't there's no
mm,
reason for them to stick to just one genre, whereas I think outside of that in sort of like, I don't know, more mainstream or more conventional festival settings, it's like, is it a drama? Is it a comedy?
yeah,
Is it a documentary? Is it narrative? Um,
I mean, to me, it's a that I had a few people I was talking with talking about like, well, it's not a documentary because it's not true. I'm like, well, it's
hmm,
to me, it's as true as any other documentary. It's like
hmm,
if not more true. It's still there's an emotional truth to the storytelling. Any documentary, there's no impartial documentary. It's there's a choice of when you're cutting and where you're putting the camera, even if you're not touching anything in frame. So
hmm.
the animatronic deer creatures, this is the emotional landscape of where things were, and it's a documentary about me making this film. Is
Right.
essentially what it is. Yeah.
Um, so I wanted to mention something else that really struck me about the film, which is I feel like there are a couple things that it expresses that are, if not taboo, things that a lot of people within Jewish communities and in general don't prefer to think about or talk about much. One of those that really struck me is when I believe it's the grandfather says surviving is nothing to do with brave, right?
Yeah.
And I think that my experience in this and other Jewish communities over many years is, for better or for worse, we tend to kind of canonize survivors. They are made to seem like saints, like living saints.
Right.
And there are very understandable reasons for that. And I think that the narratives that some survivors have lived out have a kind of heroic arc, and they do emphasize bravery and so forth. But there are plenty of people in all wars who survive not because of bravery, but because of quote unquote dumb luck,
Yeah.
because someone else was brave, but but I think that we prefer as people and within Jewish communities also for kind of moral narratives to be pretty straightforward and not messy. And I know that I'm kind of unpacking a lot from this.
Mhm.
I have just known personally Holocaust survivors whose own story was not as hope inspiring. It wasn't as much about heroism as it was about brokenness, not in a judgmental way, just like they were very broken by it and never were able to really recover.
Of course.
That's a sad story that some people I don't think prefer to dwell on.
Yeah, I don't know that I mean, the circles I've encountered, I don't think anyone I've known has ever categorized themselves as brave.
No,
Because you're loaded down with survivor's guilt, and it also you're not implying that other people weren't brave enough. Like that's
right,
not a thing.
right.
So I mean, I would think that anyone would challenge that notion that anyone would call themselves that,
Mhm,
and just wanted to call that out in as subtle a way as possible. I mean, it seemed like it's a kid asking a question. It's not at all appropriate or accurate.
mhm,
Like you're within those circumstances, and yeah, it's doing what you can. I mean, the narrative's been really interesting uh around surviving, and then how you tell those stories and how those stories are uh elevated or vulnerable, or to not wanting to sit on victimization
mm,
as a weight to use, and like this currency of suffering. um
mm,
that's It just gets competitive and and it's not from anyone who's experienced the tragedy firsthand, which isn't to say that, I guess, myself included, I will grudgingly say, I mean, it's the film is about how trauma is carried forward. Um, and I think it's up to people like us to try and parse what we can, and figure out how to move on, and it's weird to blame yourself for something that happened, or how
mm,
you're living, reacting to something that happened way before you're born.
mhm. Yeah, you touched earlier on kind of the relative success the film has had in genre circles, and
Hmm.
I'm a big horror fan. I know not everyone is interested in any of that, and I've seen your film in various places that it's been referred to online and so forth, referred to as including horror elements, which I can agree
Yeah,
with.
yeah, sure.
Um, and my experience with horror, particularly about kind of serious subjects, is that it can get at the essence of something. Sometimes mental illness is an example, but there are other things better than other genres
Sure.
can, or in ways other genres can't. And so I'm wondering what factored into your decision to include aspects of horror in the film.
I mean, I think I'm generally drawn to magic realism.
Hmm.
I mean, in trying to unpack it all lately, I think it sort of started with fairy tales as a kid, and being drawn to them, and being drawn to the darker fairy tales. And that probably comes from hearing stories in broken Yiddish really casually told, and me understanding some of the words but not the other words, and filling in more things. And it's always, here's a village in the woods, and it all didn't seem that far off. And like, I don't know what the distance is between Hansel and Gretel and an oven there, and what happened in the war. Um, but there's something that my kid brain went and sort of tried to parse out, and figure out, and made a link. Um, in terms of like there was also here's fantasy, but here's historical reality of people I know that are talking very matter-of-factly about suffering in not a way that was aggrandizing. It was just a very
Mm,
casual, oh yeah, then this happened. Oh, yeah, oh, can you believe they did that? Oh wow. Yeah.
mm,
Um, and it's yeah, I mean it's so interesting to have it's probably the wrong word, but to have this event, which is not one event, but it's many, many events,
mhm,
um, that's this big shift for I mean
mm.
a community that's of course hears their own stories differently and well, it's a community made up of lots of communities. But yeah, it's this one prism that's refracting all these other impressions and feelings. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
That's okay.
it sounded
Um,
good in my head.
I think at one point in the film, uh, it might be in the narration, there's mention made of films as a way to help the filmmaker unpack
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, uh, are there particular things that making this film and then presenting this film to the world have helped you unpack?
I mean, historically, I've found that making things either without knowing why I'm making them or because of something else, usually there's an element of healing that comes in there, just by kind of bringing it up to the surface. Or you look down at it afterwards and be like, oh, I guess this is what I was feeling. I didn't know this is what
Mm,
this was about. So, uh, and generally in my artistic practice, if it was uh, whatever other thing I was making. Um, I'm always excited. I'd rather do the thing where I don't know if it's going to turn out or how it's going to turn out.
mhm,
I'm more excited by discovering that, and I figure if I am, then the audience will be too. Um, with this film in particular, uh, it changed how I thought about my parents, and
mm,
trying, as I probably say that in the film, about looking at them sort of through a different lens and with more kindness. Um, examining, especially becoming a parent, like that's a huge kind of factor of things. And there's no blame in them because I mean they were raised by people that didn't have any other generation above them to help. So you know
right.
their parents are suffering and didn't know how
Mm,
to talk about it, and then so they they've which isn't their responsibility. And then my parents are trying not realizing that hearing their parents wake up crying every night as a child is affecting
mm,
them. And it's like it's
mm,
and them being told the stories casually too, and just being like, oh yeah, this is just something you have to know about. But yeah, so again, I don't know if I was too young to hear the stories or when you are
mm,
supposed to hear the stories, or but realizing that my parents probably heard the same stories at least that age,
mm,
or at least were more aware of it. If not, I'm not sure. I don't know where that sits. Although, I mean, I guess the whenever the big wave of I guess their generation probably didn't grow up with as much cinematic interpretations of it,
mm,
and in the public consciousness where it sort of I guess late 70s, early 80s, it kind of became the thing that we're talking about, and that where the time where I grew up, that's when everything became shorthand, and it's just like, oh yeah, that's what everybody knows, but it's not necessarily common knowledge anymore anyway.
right. Right. And then there was the milestone of Schindler's List, for better or for
Mhm.
worse, that I
Yep.
still get asked about because of my last name. But it really, that was the thing that if you know one thing about the Holocaust, you know Schindler's List, which is,
Yeah.
it's, there are pluses and minuses to that, I
Yeah.
guess.
It's like a primer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I mean, Taika Waititi, I was hearing him talk about, like, just brought up the other day. He was just saying how, like, yeah, the stories, because whatever the percentages of people that don't know what happened or even know what it is, if you just say the
mhm,
word, um, I mean, not only around the world, but in America as well. Um, so that these stories do need to be told, and they need to be told in new ways, and to keep re-engaging with them in interesting ways. Yeah.
and he would certainly know,
Yeah.
having made Jojo Rabbit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I was gonna. ask something else next, but I noticed, is that David Lynch behind you there?
It is good old Dave, yeah.
Yeah, I have to wonder, I would imagine that to some extent he's an influence on your filmmaking just based on certain aspects of this film, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it, sure. I don't dislike the guy. I mean, my to me, the pinnacle of anything is trying to tell things honestly and to try and make things honestly. And I think probably there's nobody that makes it more honestly than him.
Hmm.
He's just he doesn't even need to understand what it is. He just knows that he has to do it. It's that sort of motivation. Uh, yeah, I think that's
Kind of channeling
something
material that he may not fully understand, but he can bring it to the surface and present it. Yeah.
very specifically. Yeah,
Yes.
so I mean it's a nice pinnacle inspiration. I mean, American Werewolf is probably that's one of the
Hmm.
most horrifying scenes I've ever seen. It's like that's let alone the like double wake up from nightmare moment, but you're talking about a Nazi werewolf with a flamethrower in a house in a residential home in America. I
Hmm.
think that they're just hanging out watching TV and then that kicks down your door. That spoke to every one of my childhood fears of like
Hmm.
this idea that yep, at some point it's inevitable. So like whether it's
Hmm.
today or the next day, at some point I have to go and hide under my bed if they're going to come up and will I be able to do anything? What should I do? And
Hmm.
feeling like yeah, asking yourself if you truly think you would be brave enough to stop people. I mean that I don't know other kids that don't grow up with this sort of what would they do in this situation?
Hmm.
And even on both sides of it. I mean, I've talked to German friends about what they would, do. And it's like, what do you, when you look inside and you see a group acting, and then how are you going to respond on either side?
Hmm.
Uh, Stephen Fry was it something about, it's easier to be your last name is Goldfarb than Himmler. Uh,
Hmm. Let's see. Okay. So toward the end, to the very end of the film, the narrator reflects on liking who he is now, having come out the other side of all of the bullying, the generational trauma, and so forth. But he also doesn't wish all of their ill effects on his own son, right?
yeah.
Which is, I wonder myself, to what extent do we have a duty to tell our kids these stories related to what happened a couple of generations ago, and to what extent is there a right or a wrong way to tell them?
Mhm.
I mean, that's
And when, yeah.
yeah, when and I think like, am I remiss if I don't belabor or put a fine point on the role of this cataclysmic event in our family's history? Do I get to decide, or am I obligated? And if so, who's obligating me? It's I don't know. I feel like your film engages. I don't know if you have thoughts about that yourself that, you touch on in the film, but maybe don't quite elaborate on.
I mean, it's a work in progress. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know. Uh, it's going to come up in school.
Yeah.
It's going to come up. It's weird, like we're building a Lego Indiana Jones thing, and it's like I don't is Indiana Jones the gateway to Nazis? Like, what's the way to discuss? Because that terrified the hell out of me as a kid.
Sure.
Um, or is Sound of Music the gateway to Nazis? Where these bumbling Nazis?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the? I mean, they're less prevalent
Mm.
in modern movies, not necessarily in modern life, but
Right.
in modern films. Um,
Mm.
so it's what's the entryway? And also with my film, because he knows about the film, he's like it's his hands are on the side of the poster. He's in the end of it. Occasionally,
Mm.
he would ask me like, "It's like, oh, when do I get to see that?" It's like
Uh,
he's participated in little silly videos we'll do for other things. So yeah, he knows about it. But my film's got this weird thing where Nazis are going to be the gateway to talk about suicide. Like here's the time when your dad tried to
mm.
talk about killing himself. So like what
Mm.
which comes first and what's how do you prepare him for things that hopefully by talking about it and talking about
Mhm.
it openly at the right time, which is yet to be determined.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah.
I'll take any advice, Neil.
I'm really in no better place than you to give it, but
Did your family talk about things a lot? I mean, your dad is a historian.
my mom, yeah.
Your mom, sorry.
No, that's fine. No, my parents were both professors of German, but my mother
Mm.
focused on specifically Holocaust memoirists, authors who wrote about their
Oh, wow.
experience, and so that's what she studied in Germany. Um, yeah, and so we spent time in Germany when I was a kid, and that was interesting as Jewish Americans.
Yeah,
But a lot, and that's our heritage, of course. But a lot of American Jews, particularly my grandmother's generation, but also my parents, never want to have anything to do with Germany, and it was a huge part of our life.
that was enormous. That was enormously like I had gone there after a trip to Israel. I did like the
Mm.
birthright trip and
Oh wow,
whatever year that was.
yeah.
And I was didn't have much money and I'm like, oh, I'm halfway in the world. I'm gonna backpack and I'm at the point where I can still get the rail pass
Hmm.
and travel around and but it was something I could never tell my grandparents I'd gone to Germany,
Ah,
you know.
they'd be
So
too
it's like,
upset.
where's Sean? Somewhere else, I don't
Wow.
even remember if I told my parents at the time. It might have been not until afterwards. Um, but I was just there a few months ago for a film festival, which is the first
Mhm.
time I'd been there since '99.
Oh
Uh,
my.
and so it was strange to walk around Germany with this film. Um, I'd also brought it to Bavaria, but
Mm.
which was its own different thing because Bavaria is not Berlin.
Right.
It's sort of set in a. It feels like a set. It feels like a
Mm.
movie set of people very rooted in this past and that mythologizing this past that didn't actually exist. So it's strange to see. It felt like you're stepping into a movie set, this colorful
Mm.
German past. But Berlin was interesting. It's interesting to see it with the crowd there, and played it screened a few times. And like the first time there's like no one laughing. I'm like, oh, this is strange. I haven't seen a
Mm.
version of this film. Like, okay, fair enough, fair enough. Um, but walking around the city there, it felt really warm. It felt comfortable and friendly, which is
Mm.
strange because it's with all everything going on in the Middle East, there's heightened security everywhere. I'm like, what's going on there? Why are those people yelling? Oh, it's in front of the Jewish nursery school.
Oh
I'm
wow.
like, okay, cool, great. This is interesting.
Mm.
Um, but even aside from that, there was this visceral connection to the place where it did feel. I mean, I'm in Toronto as well as a lot of North America. Uh, there's not as much history to the buildings and the time and
Mm.
um, something about the density and the way the buildings were. It felt it felt connected to it, which
Mm.
is a conflicting feeling.
Yes. Yeah. Can understand that. Yeah, we were in Freiburg mostly, so definitely not Berlin either. Bit more provincial, which again, it's has its charms, but it's very different.
Was that in the 80s,
Yeah,
90s,
the
80s? Yeah,
80s.
yeah,
That's right. Yeah, including before, well, most of the 80s was before the wall fell. So
yeah,
we
yeah.
were able to go over to East Germany and see what that was like.
Right.
Fascinating. Um, Let me ask just a couple more things and then I'll let you off the hook if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, so first of all, what have your family members' responses to the film been like?
Uh, Excellent question, Neil. Um, so I wanted to have my parents see it in a theater
Hmm.
because I knew that they needed to respond to it with a crowd as
Yeah.
opposed to just sort of watching it in a room. They needed to see other people getting it, laughing, not laughing, feeling moved.
Mm.
Uh, and then my partner talked to my mom afterwards, and she said, my partner said to my mom, "Was like, oh, yeah, I always have seen the movie a bunch of times, but I always like I cry a lot. So I actually cry a lot."
Mm.
I was like, "Oh, what do you mean? What part?" And she's like, "Oh, all right, okay."
Mm.
Uh, and then my dad, after the screening, kind of came up to me and went, "It's like, oh, just so you know, I never thought you were a coward." I'm like, all right.
Oof.
And then that was it. like I asked my mom, I've asked her a bunch of times over, I guess they stopped asking now, but this is earlier this year they saw it, or last year they saw it, and she's like, oh, I'm still processing, so, which is just like, not is not atypical. Sort of, I think how people engage with it is has been really interesting.
Mm,
So her way was to generally, mm, to my outside eyes, was to not engage with things,
mm,
um, and just sort of just stick it inside, and whether you look at it or not, because it's just too painful to look at. Where I mean, she again, this is from my own vantage point of a kid. It always seemed like my mother was the person who's like, I'm gonna be quiet, not say anything, and no one's gonna find me. That's my plan.
mm,
And my dad grew up in Brazil, and his plan was like, I'm gonna be strong and tough, and no one's gonna do that again. And that's like, I'm gonna fight everybody and just have this aggression around me,
mhm,
uh, and that's gonna be my response. So as a kid, I was sort of pulled between
mhm.
these two, and it sort of felt like, yeah, do I hide? Do I fight? I know I can't fight, so even if I should, because I'm just a kid, so I guess I should hide. And then that sort of took on an identity, which is it's weird what makes you. Um,
Mhm.
Especially with a kid, as you see it growing up, you're like, what is making him? What is making him be this way?
Right, right. And I can relate to the response that is essentially risk aversion, like not wanting to stick your neck out, not wanting to
Yeah,
stand out too much or be vulnerable in that way. I think that that is maybe more common even than the other response you were talking about of kind of trying to present as strong, although there's certainly that as well.
certainly is. Which I
Mhm,
understand as well. It's a not wanting to be defined by if it's a perceived weakness, it's not like it's got to be strength, and that's how we survive. That's how we make it through. Um, so but yeah, it's the idea of what is a survivor and what makes a survivor, and if that's even a fair term to call somebody.
mm,
Um, because it's yeah, it doesn't leave you. You didn't like go through it and now you're done.
right, right. Can you tell me a bit about the song that runs over the end credits, how you
Yeah,
chose?
yeah. Eufen Boim. Do you know the song yourself?
I don't, but so we have a selection committee that looks at all the films and everything, and one of them said like she really appreciated that song being used. And of course, I wasn't familiar with it. I'm not uh I'm not much of a Yiddishist, but I'm interested to hear what motivated
Yeah.
choosing it.
My grandfather had sung it a bunch. And I found a bunch of cassette tapes after he passed away where he was just singing songs, and that was, I mean, it's
Mm,
not him on there, but it's a gentleman from he's in Eastern Europe, and he's got his beautiful voice. Um, so it's an old Yiddish song, and I almost put subtitles in at the end of the film, and it's based on a Yiddish poet who had it was a poem first, and then added lyrics, whatever it was. I think the poet was 1800s, but
mm,
it's about a boy who wants to go off on his own and kind of adventure and see the world, and wants to turn into a bird. He's like, and
mm,
it's crushing. I don't know if I can talk about it without
mm,
crying. But it's yeah, you should listen to it with the lyrics. But he wants to go, and his mom's like, no, it's cold outside. You need to bring a coat because you're gonna freeze on the branch over there.
mm,
And it's her keep weighing him down with other things, and like, take a scarf, take mittens, and he just wants to kind of be free and fly. But she wants to keep him there, and she's protecting him or harming him or not. Like, what is it about that story and song? And but yeah, it's super heavy and heartfelt. And I think at the end
mm,
he, but he just wants to turn into a bird and fly away.
mm.
But Eufenboim, so it's like on
Wow.
a branch sits a bird.
Okay, well, it certainly makes a lot more sense now that I understand the meaning. I'll have to listen to it again and look at the lyrics and
I think I've only had two people call it out on a few screenings, like, oh my, I can't believe you used Eufenboim. I love
mm,
that song. Oh, okay,
yeah.
great.
Well,
It's kind of a lullaby-ish too, to tell your kids about the
yeah.
mom not letting them go away. But it was a lullaby.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. So I always have to ask this, is there anything that you're working on now or that is kind of in the near future for you that you are okay talking about? I know that you said previous to this you didn't make any films that were explicitly Jewish themed, and I don't know if you know where you're going next as a filmmaker or not, but I'm curious to know.
I mean, I've got a number of projects in various stages, but I never know where I'm going actually next.
Fair
Um, yeah, you don't have to ask that question, but I've got a. So I actually moved into my grandfather's house after he passed away with my family,
enough.
which is its own weird thing where I'm making films about the past while literally living in the past. Uh, so it's its own kind of head trip. Um, but it's, fun seeing my kid play on the same stuff I shouldn't have played on as a kid. Like, that's danger. How dare you? I turned out okay. Don't climb on. All right, fine. So ended up shooting a film in the house because my grandfather was a sweatshop tailor after he got to Canada, and his house is very bespoke. I mean, every
Mm,
room has got its own different vibe.
mm,
He would just sort of create things and never thought he couldn't do something. Um, it just didn't occur to him. So he would. There's also. I mean, there's so much to literally unpack, but uh, he's got like secret passageways in the house. Like he'd built in these other weird little hiding spots to mostly hide things in. But there's like, oh, here's a false wall. Move that behind, and you're like,
oh wow.
and a lot of it just seems like him trying to be innovative or curious and see if he could do it more than necessity.
Hmm.
But it's still there. Like there's, you take a magnet over this piece of metal over here and it lifts up this really long nail that now releases this little trap door that you can go. And so it's
Wow.
yeah,
Sounds amazing.
it's absolutely amazing. So I'm like, I have to
Mm,
capture this in some way. So I've shot a film here, and it was done with great urgency because I didn't know if the house would be gone.
mhm,
So I'm working on that. It's called Alterations. It's a
mm,
feature. I'm in development on a few other feature projects that we're applying for grants for, and I've shown that they're generally about storytelling, and it's how
mm,
stories are told, why you tell them, who is telling them, whether they have business telling them or not,
mm.
and also how stories change and if they're allowed to change and should they change, and probably yes to live like any of us. So there's those, and then it wasn't until I went to Bavaria with this film that uh, I think every film up till now I've done is like I could see how this would be a feature. That would be, it's the calling card for this short or this music video or
Mm.
whatever. And this was one of the few films I've made where I'm like, no, no, this film is this film.
Mhm.
That's all it is. It's all it's meant to be. Um,
It's not a proof of
it's
concept.
not a proof of concept. It's not trying to get anything else. I'm going to tell this as honestly as I can. That's what it's going to be, is what it's going to be. And I was in Bavaria and I'm like, okay, I kind of know how I make this a feature. So that's been bubbling and brewing in the back of the head,
Mm.
and taking the sort of meta side farther, and then bringing the film into the film, of making the film. And yeah, so it's got its own narrative that deconstructs as it goes, which I guess is all where my head is at these days.
Well, I will tell you that a member of the festival staff, which is small, I will give you that, but commented after seeing the film that she recognizes that it is not for everyone, but for the people who it is for, it will mean everything. And I feel like that's true. I think that this film gets at certain things in ways that I hadn't seen and that were very meaningful to me and resonant and moving. And so I very much appreciate your having made it, and I'm very pleased that we'll be presenting it to folks here in Spokane. So
I'm thrilled. Thank you, Neil.
yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad it's finding its community, which anywhere it plays, it seems to really connect with people. And the thing that I've been most moved by maybe is the fact that it's connected people across backgrounds. So if it's an Indian woman coming up to me after there and saying like, I haven't seen a film about generational trauma told this way. This is so
Mm,
I connected with this so deeply. Or yeah, someone from the Congo came up to me and talked about it. It's like, this is like my family. This is the way we
wow.
talked and didn't talk about it. I'm like, wow, that's that. You know, so I think there is something, the more specific you get, the more specificity, the more kind of universal it is. There's something at the core of the truth of it, I think, that will connect with people. So I mean, I'm touched by that. Uh, and yeah, very grateful people have shared that with me, and I'm happy when the film gets seen and people are talking about it.
Well, I'm sure, I have no doubt that people will talk long after the screening about it, and that's one of the reasons we're showing it. So, thank you so much for talking with me today, and I will certainly let you know how it goes when
Thank
we
you.
show it to our audience here.
Neal, I super enjoyed chatting with you.
Same here. All right. Well, take care, and I will be in touch.
All right, take care. See you. Thanks,
Bye.
Neal.